You make a pretty interesting case, and in some ways it's kind of counterintuitive. You basically say that stakeholder capitalism,
Mhm.
it's supposed to create accountability, but it actually does the exact opposite and kind of empowers America's enemies in the process. Incredible.
It is counterintuitive because stakeholder capitalism is the philosophy that a business ought to serve not just its shareholders by pursuing profit, but also ought to serve other societal interests, including those of not only employees, but other societal stakeholders ranging from minority communities to the climate. Now, on the face of it, that sounds pretty benign. But the argument I make in the book is, first of all, I think it is actually a violation of American democracy to concentrate in the hands of a small group of investors and executives the power to not only decide what products get voted to the top, but what ideas get voted to the top. And that's the role of our democracy to play, where everyone's voice and vote counts equally. And what I say is that once we delegate that responsibility to a small group of elites and executives, we actually look a lot more like old world Europe, where a small group of church leaders and business elites used to decide what was the good was for everybody else, as opposed to the American system, which was supposed to delegate that to the American people at large in a democracy where everyone's voice counts equally. Now, one of the things I also described in the book, and you alluded to this, is that once corporations then become vehicles for advancing, say, progressive agendas, as many of them do today, they become vehicles to advance anybody's agenda. And nobody has gotten in on that game more effectively than the Communist Party of China. By becoming the strongest stakeholder of all in many of these corporations, that stakeholder is now flexing its muscle in ways that I unveil in the book. And I don't think anybody has really talked about the geopolitical implications of wokeism or woke capitalism like I do in this book. But at the end of the day, it's less about just offering a critique and more about seeing the problem with a clear-eyed lens so as to offer a better way forward.
It's actually quite fascinating to learn some companies do have the Chinese regime as a major stakeholder, but kind of, don't really disclose that very much and instead focus on all the much prettier looking stakeholders here in America.
I think the great policy error over the last 30 years in the United States was thinking that we could use capitalism as a vector to spread democracy abroad, that we could export Big Macs and Happy Meals and think that would somehow spread democracy in places like China. And what we've learned over the last 30 years is that China has actually turned that model on its head. Instead of using our money to get them to be more like us, they have now used their money to get us to be more like them. They've sent back Disney sneakers and Nike movies as Trojan horses to advance their values. And I'll tell you what I mean. When companies relentlessly criticize the United States for social injustice, as the woke brand of stakeholder capitalism, or what we call woke capitalism, does, Nike criticizes racial injustice, Disney criticizes injustices ranging from transphobia to United States policy on abortions. As these companies criticize the United States, they also don't say a peep about actual human rights abuses in China. Say what's happening in the Xinjiang province today, where over 1 million Uyghurs are enslaved in concentration camps, subject to forced sterilization, in some of the worst human rights abuses committed by a major nation since the Third Reich of Germany. These companies don't say a peep about it. And what that has the effect of doing is creating a false moral equivalence between the United States and China. And that actually erodes our greatest geopolitical asset of all. That is not our nuclear arsenal. It is our moral standing on the global stage. And when the new international arbiters of moral justice become multinational corporations, the people who are known to criticize injustice in the United States, when they don't say a peep about China, that actually empowers China. And if you have any doubt that that's intentional, you can actually listen to really carefully what Xi Jinping is saying or what China's other diplomats are saying. Last year, when Xi Jinping is pressed by the EU on the Uyghur human rights crisis, the first thing that he says is that, hold on, Black Lives Matter shows that the United States is no better. Their top diplomat came to Alaska earlier this year, and he said that China wanted to see the United States stop slaughtering Black Americans, and that China wanted to see the U.S. do better on human rights. Now, these would be laughable if it weren't for the fact that, unfortunately, you don't now have to take it from Xi Jinping. You could just take it from Disney or Nike or the NBA or BlackRock, and you would actually see some validation for what he's saying, even though it's based on a false premise. So that's the other thing that I think liberals and conservatives ought to fear equally, is that the Communist Party of China, I think, represents the single greatest threat to not only the United States, but I think that the modern liberal democracies of the West. The idea of modern liberal democracy itself, the modern liberalism itself, I think, is threatened by the rise of nihilism in the avatar of China. And I think they've realized how to use the kinks in our armor, ranging from wokeism, which is a culture of self-criticism in the United States, to woke capitalism, where companies are able to use their corporate muscle to supercharge that wokeness while supplicating to the CCP to be able to do business there. That's actually one of the great dangers geopolitically of this game as well that I unveil in the book.
Well, it's very interesting, in the woke ideology, essentially, everything boils down to being the fault of white heterosexual men, right? I mean, that's a very oversimplified version. You can also correct me if you feel I'm saying anything wrong. But that also creates a bit of this kind of a smokescreen that you're describing, right? There's kind of an ideological positioning to always bring
Yes.
it back to America.
Yes, so the heart of wokeism is to take the essence of Marxist thought, which is to say that the social universe is governed by these invisible social relationships, but to make one crucial change. And that's to say that instead of economic power relationships, the real social relationships that govern power structures in the universe are based on the genetic characteristics that you inherit on the day that you're born, your race, your gender, your sexual orientation. And on the basis of those criteria, which intersect with one another, per the theory of intersectionality, you have a ranked order hierarchy based on who's disempowered and who's empowered in the structure. But crucially, unlike Marxism, somewhat disconnected to the amount of money that you have or the economic class that you're a member of, connected solely to the attributes that you're born with. And so you could be a rich black woman like Oprah Winfrey and still be disempowered according to the rules of wokeism and intersectionality relative to a poor white male in the Rust Belt or in my neighborhood or in my greater neighborhood in central Ohio. Okay. So that's the central tenet of wokeism, is that your race, your gender, and your sexual orientation govern who you are, what you're allowed to think. And it also conflates your race with the views that you're allowed to have. You don't have to take that from me. You can take it from Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley of the Squad, who famously said about a year ago that we don't want any more black faces that don't want to be a black voice. We don't want any more brown faces that don't want to be a brown voice. Now, personally, I probably don't fit her description of what counts as a brown voice, but we'll put that to one side. What that means is once wokeism is able to convert your race from being not just about your skin color, but about your voice and your identity and the thoughts you're supposed to represent, then that means that if you disagree with those thoughts, you're actually a racist, whether or not you know it, by definition. And I think that was the intellectual jujitsu that's created this new culture of fear, where if you disagree with any of those claims, if it actually means you're racist, and there's no greater damnation in modern America than to be called a racist, then when you're faced with the choice between bending your knee to this new religion or being tarred with the scarlet R of racism, everyday Americans are choosing to bend the knee. And that's what's created this culture of fear in our country that's completely replaced our culture of free speech. It's completely replaced our culture of free and open dialogue, fear of losing your job, fear of your kids getting a bad grade at school, fear of becoming a pariah in your own community. That's actually defying what I think is the best test of any democracy, which is the percentage of people who are willing to say what they actually think in public. And I have no doubt that today we are doing abysmally on that metric. A lot of the survey data that I lay out in the book backs that up as well. This is a time of effectively living in a modern Red Guard revolution in America, except instead of the Chinese Red Guard pushing the philosophy of Marxism, the new Red Guard, through all of our major institutions, from the private sector to the public, are pushing this new philosophy of wokeism. Someone inside needed to sound the alarm bell. That's why I wrote the book, and that's really what unveils the scam for what it is, which is even elites in corporate America are pretending to care about this new woke agenda, about something other than profit and power, precisely to accrete more of each. And I'm not a journalist writing about this from the outside. I wasn't born into elite America, but I've lived it for the last 15 years, from places like Harvard and Yale to elite hedge funds to founding a multi-billion-dollar company. I've seen in the corridors of elite America how this game is played, and someone needed to blow the whistle on it, and that's the role I decided to take up in writing this book.
Well, and you also have a pretty, fascinating background. I mean, basically, your father made a point of you going back to India regularly and basically immerse yourself in living in that culture in all sorts of ways. And I'm kind of, it's a little bit like my background. I ended up living in actually what was my parents escaped from communist Poland. But as a kid, without them, I was able to be there for a while and live in this very, very different culture. And it gave me kind of a unique perspective on the world. As you were describing this, and as I saw you develop your book, I was thinking this is the product of someone who has actually lived in a few different realities. Because it kind of comes through as you go through the book.